So this was, it was good entertainment. There was a lot of content. But I think the picture is very incomplete. And let me tell you why. And I'll put incompleteness in two buckets. One is focusing on sort of the financial crisis aspect. I think there's some incompleteness that needs to be thought through. And then the second bucket, which is a lot shorter, is, because it was shorter in the film as well, on sort of the education component. And let me start with, a disclaimer. I am a card-carrying, PhD-earned economist. As an aside, I might note that there were no PhD card-carrying women economists interviewed in the film.
Yeah, it's not the first time that somebody says it.
Right.
It's noticed.
I also, in the sort of the disclosure category, my dissertation advisor was Paul Krugman. And I worked for Alan Greenspan for about 10 years. I could disclose other things, but those are probably the relevant things. So let me say why I think that the picture has a really important incompleteness to it. And the incompleteness is with regard to not the causes of financial crises, where I think it's actually quite good. It is incomplete with regard to talking about policy reactions after a financial crisis occurs. And I think that this is a very important incompleteness, because I would argue that the one important reason why our current situation following the financial crash of 2008, why that looks so like the Great Depression in its length, or so persistence, in the depth, in the damage to the global economy, to individuals, that has to do with the policy response after the crisis, and not so much to the crisis itself. So let me kind of work through that. Okay, and talk a little bit about some other kind of aspects along the way. So we have a creation of a bubble. We have a trigger in transmission, in other words, the crash. We have immediate reactions, what gets done at the moment, and then we have the subsequent policy response. Okay, so I think that the movie does a terrific job on everything but the last one of those. The creation of a bubble. Okay, it's euphoria, it's human nature. I'm going to agree with that. It's hurting. It's looking at the Joneses and saying, I want to be like them. A bubble is made worse by liquidity and leverage, which in the movie is called margin. Okay, you can, it's if you have a lot of liquidity and you can have a high margin, so that you have a lot of, that accentuate the gains, which of course accentuate the losses. That makes the bubble bigger, and it makes the crash much worse. What triggers a crash? That's the really tough thing. Bubonic plague, I guess, in the tulip mania, I guess is the assumption. A war that breaks out. What was it in the case of 2008? Lehman Brothers, plausibly true, okay? But the bigger the bubble, in other words, the greater the liquidity and the more the leverage, the bigger is going to be the crash. So the immediate reaction differs according in different in each one of these. But in this, it's who do you make whole, and how do you make whole? And we've had, in my period of time as an economist, Latin American debt crisis. In fact, I was involved with that one in the sense that I was lending. I was auditing loans made by Chase Manhattan Bank in countries around the world, including in Latin America. And we looked at all those loans and we said, yeah, they're not really great loans, but they're guaranteed by the government, so therefore it's okay. So that's what we did. I was there in the, in the S&L crisis. I was in the White House, the S&L crisis. Asian financial crisis, 97. .com, people don't remember that one so much. Why? Because there wasn't as much liquidity, there was not as much leverage, and there was not as much exposure of the financial system. Okay? And then, of course, the one we have right now. The triggers are going to be different in each case. And so the challenge that we have when deciding, is this a bubble and is it going to burst soon, is knowing in advance what the trigger is. And that's really tough. And that's an essential problem of this. So should we cut off the tops of all bubbles? A lot of people say so. It should be leaning against asset bubbles. That's kind of the language that we use these days, leaning against asset bubbles. Well, this is where we ask questions, is what do you gain by letting a bubble roll? Because you do. You do gain from letting a bubble roll, and I think the most obvious example is .com. An awful lot of really good, innovative ideas in information technology and the transmission of information technology broadly throughout the economy, particularly in the US, was precipitated by letting that bubble roll for a long time. So, immediate reaction. This is where systems have differed a lot. But I think one of the most successful cleanups or successful responses to a financial crisis, and this has been looked at a lot, is Sweden, 1997. Why is it viewed as successful? Because they removed the management of the institutions in question. They took the bad loans off the balance sheets of the banks, put them in a side location, and when they removed the bad assets and they removed the bad managers, it was kind of like a clean slate. And that allowed the Swedish economy to recover much more quickly. That's not what the United States did. It's not what most countries did. And in fact, it still is not what Europe has done to its banks' balance sheets or managers. So let me get into the last one. Subsequent policy response. Okay, this is all the other stuff that policymakers get to do in the context of cleaning up after a financial crisis. 1929, tightened monetary policy and cut fiscal spending. That's what Hoover did. That's what the Federal Reserve did at the time. Widely viewed as being a disaster, a disastrous policy response to the financial crisis, and made the Depression what it was. The financial crisis precipitated a problem which was exacerbated by the wrong policy response by both fiscal and monetary institutions. And then it is made worse internationally through the use of increasing tariffs, and in some other countries tying back to gold and a variety of other things. So it allowed it percolated damaging policy internationally, and thus made the Great Depression kind of universal. So how do we think about that in Latin America, for example? So there was the subsequent policy response of We're not going to take the bad loans off the balance sheets of the bank, because if we do that, those banks are going to go bankrupt, and we don't want to let that happen. And so we're going to put new money in, and that new money will pay off the old money, but it will do nothing to support new investment and growth in Latin America. That was Baker Plan, for those of you who are historians. And it wasn't until the Brady Plan came in that recognized that we had to have big haircuts, in other words, reducing the value of the principal of the loans, in order for Latin America to actually be able to resume its growth. We could go through examples for each one of these, but I will be over my time by a lot, I am sure, because I'm already getting there, at 11 minutes. Okay. So what about now? What about what was done by policymakers in 2008? There's a lot of monetary ease out there. Look at the balance sheets of the financial institutions. But in Europe, for example, there was monetary tightening, actual interest rate increases, in 2011. And of course, throughout Europe, there has been a focus on fiscal consolidation, which of course is opposite to fiscal stimulus. So if that sounds like a recipe similar to what the Federal Reserve and Hoover did in the Great Depression in the United States, it should sound similar, because it is. So, subsequent policy response is a key ingredient to whether or not a system can recover from a financial crisis. There's no question that financial crises are going to occur again. The question is, who's going to take the fall for it, and how bad is it going to be? And that's where regulation comes back in. How much liquidity do we allow in the system? How much leverage? That's kind of the regulation of institutions. How much do we allow institutions to lobby for their own regulation, the self-regulation part? Hasn't been too successful. I think that's fair to say. And the related part is, how stupid do we let individuals be with their own money? This is a very difficult question. We allow a lot of countries to have lotteries as a fundamental way of raising tax revenue. Lotteries prey on the least financial literate people. So if we're going to protect individuals, which I think is an important question, and in fact it was brought up this question came up when I was at the Federal Reserve, and I was working on working with the BIS financial stability. It was prior to the Financial Stability Committee. It was a precursor of that. And we talked about separating retail banking from other banking, sophisticated investors from kind of like everybody else. But it's really hard to draw that line. And frankly, different countries have different attitudes about where to draw that line because of fundamental differences in views of individual rights. And that's something that is just a challenge to policymaking, which has to be done universally across banking systems because we have the international flow of capital. So let me take just 1 minute or 2 minutes to talk about the education component of the film. As I say, I'm a card-carrying PhD economist. I was an undergraduate in economics as well. I don't recognize the institution, the academic, and actually most recently before I came to the OECD, I was a professor. So I actually had skin in the game here. I don't recognize the institution that is identified there, that academic institution. It wasn't my undergraduate, it wasn't my PhD, and it's not the way I teach. So, I just don't recognize who you're talking about there. I will recognize that there are a lot of people who fall into that category, but it's not the profession that I know, and it's not most of the people that I have as colleagues. So, so I guess I'll leave it at that.